How about now? Yeah. Great. The on switch, it always helps. So good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Laura Sparks. I'm the president of the Cooper Union, and I'm so pleased to have you join us for what I expect will be an incredible exploration of photography, art, literature, and New York City culture. Roy DeCarava graduated from the Cooper Union nearly 80 years ago, but like so many of our illustrious alumni, his body of work remains significant and develops new meaning in the world we live in today. We're delighted to host this discussion at his alma mater and in this historic Great Hall. While this stage has hosted so many prolific individuals who have helped shape the civic life and history of our nation, it also serves the New York City community, specifically welcoming people regardless of gender, race, religion, or class to gather and listen and learn and debate the prominent issues of the day. Like the individuals in DeCarava's and Langston Hughes' The Sweet Flypaper of Life, the visitors to the Great Hall are a true picture of our great city. I really want to thank the individuals who helped make today possible and help bring this group of voices to the forefront. First, esteemed art historian Sherry Turner DeCarava, without whom the legacy of Roy wouldn't be highlighted and shared to the extent that it is today. His art lives on through the platforms that you've created, that you've developed, and that you've been instrumental in providing at events like this, and of course at the Brooklyn Museum, where his work is currently featured in exhibition, Soul of a Nation. We are so honored, so pleased, and so grateful to have you here tonight, and thank you for putting this together. Thanks also to David Zwirner Books and Gallery, which represent the estate of Roy DeCarava and act as stewards for his extraordinary images, particularly through the republication of the Sweet Flypaper, our focus of our evening, and an exhibition planned for 2019, which will mark the centennial anniversary of the artist's birth. My gratitude to the team from Zwirner and the team here from the School of Art and our Public Programs Department for organizing and producing tonight's event. Please join us again for additional programming in the Great Hall. We love to welcome folks back, and we think we have a really great lineup of things to discuss with you. We're fortunate to have tonight a really talented panel who bring multiple perspectives to the work, but who are similarly well-versed in DeCarava's work, particularly Thelma Golden, the director and chief curator of the Studio Museum in Harlem, who will be moderating the session. Thelma, I know you're in the back and hopefully watching, but your leadership of this ambitious New York City institution has brought thoughtful explorations on race and identity to global audiences while remaining focused on the community it serves. I'm so personally inspired by Thelma's dedication to her craft, as I imagine are the many young artists whose careers she has helped shape. Thank you to Thelma Golden. And our fantastic panelists, our own Lesley Hewitt, assistant professor in the School of Art, John Stauffer, the Sumner R and Marshall S. Cates Professor of English and African American Studies at Harvard, photographer Hope Wurmfeld, independent filmmaker Radiclani Clytus, and a writer and critic A'00 Coleman. We are so pleased to have all of them here tonight to explore Roy DeCarava's contributions within the larger context of American art and society. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sherry Turner DeCarava.
I don't think we can say it enough. Welcome and thank you. Thank you, President Sparks, for so generously hosting this special occasion at the Great Hall of Cooper Union. Thanks also to the Assistant Dean of the Art School, Adriana Farmiga, to Wendy DeCarava's team and friends of First Print Press, to David Zwirner and Lucas Zwirner and Marlene Zwirner of Zwirner Books for arranging with that wonderful distributing channel, DAP, for our art books to be seen all over the world. All of these efforts are being done in honor of Roy DeCarava, photographer, and Langston Hughes, poet and writer. It was through a chance meeting of these two artists, Hughes, the older established gentleman well known in the community, and Roy DeCarava, a young, clear-eyed but committed artist, that led to the creation of a book that brings us all here today. Such things can happen in New York, it being the city of dreams, sometimes miracles, and a lot of hard work. Roy and I talked about the conversation on that Harlem corner between himself and Langston, and as the details emerged, one theme stood out above all others: trust. Roy trusted Langston enough to give him a large group of pictures to write about. Eventually, by this process, I describe in the afterword of the new edition, these pictures were assembled as the Sweet Flypaper of Life. Roy was amazed at how the poet was in sync with the real personalities of the individuals photographed, and trusting Hughes offered no direction, no editorial. He did not intervene at all. Just as their collaboration was based on artistic trust, so too was this a key element for Roy, the trust offered to him by the people he photographed. Roy then gained the freedom to feel through the lens what was unfolding before him, expressing that which had been entrusted to him, both by his subjects, but also by his commitment to an aesthetic process. With the widespread presence of photography today, it is difficult to imagine, even to emphasize, how radical Roy's view of photography in subject and treatment was at the time. For the most part, photographs were understood by the general public as primarily a ceremonial event, a commercial enterprise engaged uptown through storefront photo studios in the community. Yet DeCarava continued to develop his own views on photography, and he gradually was in the company of a small group of photographers in New York who held similar views, considering the artistic medium, photography, as the medium of the modern era. But Roy's early project, this rendering of a representation of African American life, was an essential statement for him, a statement of discovery and presentation, a subject that held extreme importance to him personally. There are many details of Hughes's and DeCarava's struggle to make Sweet Flypaper a reality in the world, to maintain distribution, to keep it from going permanently out of print, that I will have to save for another time, but all of which makes this event more remarkable. And one event underlines the thought. There are few homes I have visited in New York that didn't have a copy of this book on their shelves from the 1950s. Truly an authentic, from the people vote. Even after 30 years of absence, people ask me if it will still be out of print or if it will come back into print. They sent cards upon its early publication to the publisher, Simon & Schuster, saying, "Oh, I know these people. This is my brother, this is my cousin." Again, a statement of how it appealed to diverse people and diverse communities. Conducting such a wide and far-reaching agenda as the young photographer had assigned to himself was a complexity, and it remains so now, but it has in this time been taken on by some of the most able curators and directors in New York. Thelma Golden is director and chief curator of the Studio Museum in Harlem, where she began her career in 1987, before joining the Whitney Museum of American Art in 1988. After a decade at the Whitney, she returned to the Studio Museum and was named director and chief curator in 2005. Golden was appointed to the Committee for the Preservation of the White House by President Obama in 2010, and in 2015 joined the Barack Obama Foundation's Board of Directors. In 2018, she was awarded a J. Paul Getty Medal and received an honorary degree from Columbia University as just one of many of her accolades. In addition to all of these credentials, I have known her personally for 25 years. She's an individual with an indomitable work ethic, a finely tuned eye and ear who's taken on a massive task, nothing less than to rewrite the history of art in the contemporary era, to change the rules that for too long and too often excluded so many talented artists and architects because of reasons we all know are wrong. With the determination and leadership she has shown through her career, but specifically at the Studio Museum, she has used her position and access to empower artists and embolden curators. A new generation of young men and women, especially people of color, to grab onto this contested cultural space, to grapple with it in all of its contradictions, but to be unafraid and know that their work is crucial for the future of art and for us all. Indeed, it was Langston who said in an essay, quote, "An artist must be free to choose what he does, certainly, but he must also never be afraid to do what he might choose." And it was Roy DeCarava who affirmed that, while an artist, he said, "The artist must master their craft. An artist's primary responsibility, however, is to get at what they feel." I know she doesn't like too many compliments, but it is no stretch to say that we, the city, and our culture would be both far less informed and far less empathetically engaged without her dynamic and hopeful leadership. I'm delighted that she's with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Thelma Golden.
Good evening, everyone. I know I speak for the entire panel when I say we are all thrilled and honored to be here. Thank you, President Sparks and the entire Cooper Union team. Thank you to David Swerner Gallery, and thank you, Sherry Turner DeCarava and the DeCarava Archive, not only for inviting me and all of us to be here tonight to have this opportunity to think about this important, significant, incredible, radical work, but also to have the opportunity to celebrate Roy DeCarava and his immeasurable contribution to the history of art. This evening, we are going to split our time up in a couple of different ways, but I would like to start by introducing this incredible panel, and I'm going to introduce them in the order that they will speak when we get to the panel portion. No, I'm going to introduce you, I'm changing my mind. I'm going to introduce you as you are sitting next to me. So starting with A.D. Coleman, who is an independent critic, historian, curator, and educator, who has published 8 books and more than 2,500 essays on photography and related subjects. Formerly a columnist for the Village Voice, the New York Times, and the New York Observer. Coleman has contributed to many periodicals here and abroad. In recent years, Coleman has received the Culture Prize of the German Photographic Society, the J. Dudley Johnson Award from the Royal Photographic Society in the United Kingdom, the Society for Photographic Education's Insight Award for lifetime contribution to the field, and the Society of Professional Journalists Award for research about journalism. Welcome, A.D. Coleman. Next to A.D. is Lesley Hewitt, a New York-based artist and academic working with photography, sculpture, and site-specific installation. Lesley addresses fluid notions of time in her work. Hewitt studied at the Cooper Union, where she received her BFA, and Yale University School of Art, where she received her MFA, and New York University, where she was a Clark Fellow in Africana and Visual Culture Studies programs. She is currently assistant professor in the School of Art here at the Cooper Union. Welcome, Lesley. Next to Lesley is Professor John Stauffer. He is the Sumner R and Marshall S. Cates Professor of English and of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He is the author or editor of 20 books and over 100 articles which focus on anti-slavery, social protest, and photography. His book, Giants, The Parallel Lives of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, was a national bestseller. The Black Hearts of Men was the co-winner of the Frederick Douglass Book Prize and the Lincoln Prize second place winner. And Picturing Frederick Douglass was a Lincoln Prize finalist. Welcome, Professor Stauffer. Next is Hope Wurmfeld, who is a photographer and author who lives and works in New York City. As an adjunct professor in photography, she taught in the art department of Hunter College for over 20 years and has exhibited her photographs throughout the United States and across the world. Wormfeld's photographs are held in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the New York Public Library, Princeton University Library, the Smithsonian Institution, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and the University of Indiana. Welcome, Hope. And pleased to introduce Radiclani Clytus, an independent filmmaker who works at the intersections of new media and 19th century American literature and visual culture. He has written extensively on transatlantic abolitionist imagery and is the editor of 2 compilations of prose by Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Yusef Komuyaka. He is a documentary filmmaker. Clytus has received commissions from Loring Augustine Gallery, Steinway & Sons, and the United States National Park Service. Welcome, Roddy. So we're going to begin this evening's presentation with Professor Stauffer, who is going to give us some insight into the publication of Sweet Flypaper of Life.
Sherry asked me to read a brief overview of how the Sweet Flypaper of Life came into being that I had sent her a few years ago when I was an editor of a limited edition photography press, and at that time was trying to encourage her to republish or to publish a new edition of Sweet Flypaper of Life, and she was already 5 steps ahead of me, and this is an extraordinary accomplishment. The Sweet Flypaper of Life, which was first published in 1955, is a unique fusion of the verbal and the visual, and the first monograph by a black photographer and author. This small 92-page book, published 1 year after Brown v. Board of Education, combines 142 photographs of black family life in Harlem by Roy DeCarava, and a fictional narrative inspired by the images and relating to them by Langston Hughes. DeCarava had photographed Harlem on a 1952 Guggenheim Fellowship. He was the first African-American photographer to receive the award. And when Hughes saw the images, he said, "We have to get them published." But publishers declined, initially considering them too radical and subversive to make money, even while acknowledging their brilliance. Following discussions with Simon & Schuster, Hughes wrote his accompanying story, and the press published a small cloth-bound edition of only 3,000 copies, a larger paperback edition of 22,000 copies, which quickly sold out, and then in the same year another second printing of 10,000 copies. The paperback edition in particular was beautifully printed on sheet-fed gravure and arranged with great sensitivity. Sweet Flypaper has become a classic, even though it has long been out of print. It radically departs from the documentary realism of the era. Both DeCarava's photos and Hughes's fiction portray their Harlem subjects with an intimate sense of humanity and subjective autonomy that had no parallel at the time. Recent critics have called the book post or anti-documentary and have drawn attention to the unique relationship between image and text. Hughes's narrative relates to DeCarava's photographs without constraining them, allowing the pictures to live and breathe, as DeCarava himself noted. Soon after it was published, Sweet Flypaper penetrated the Iron Curtain. In 1958, it was translated and published in Czechoslovakia by the prestigious Fetova Literatura, and DeCarava's haunting photograph in the book of the bassist Edna Smith appeared in Edward Steichen's blockbuster photography show, The Family of Man, and traveled to Poland, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union in 1958. The reception of Sweet Flypaper reveals the degree to which DeCarava and Hughes's collaboration render life in Harlem as essentially African-American and yet also accessible to a diverse global audience.
Great. Thank you, John. At this moment, I'd like to read a little from Sherry Turner DeCarava's Afterword as a place to begin before you all talk about your chosen image. And she wrote, "A rich texture of call and response connects Hughes' news of the day lyricism with DeCarava's aim to visually express the true stature of a people as subjects worthy of art. Understanding our current existence, the photographer implies a future by our willingness to engage terms of love in the presence of fraught conditions. He aligns our beauty and aesthetics with close portraits in the consummate dress and drape of cloth, in the powerful artfulness of our dance. DeCarava seeks traditions of spiritual wisdom from our multiplicity of voices. He considers the experience of joy as a perception of the senses and the soul." Thank you for those words, Sherry, and a wonderful place to begin in asking each of the panelists who were given the very hard task of picking one image from Sweet Flypaper of Life to discuss. And we're going to start with Hope Wurmfeld, who will discuss graduation.
I'm a photographer, and looking at photographs, making photographs, and living with photographs has been my passion for over 50 years. I'm honored to have been asked by Sherry to be on this panel and to share the stage with such an esteemed group of artists and writers. Roy's warmth, humor, sensitivity, and generosity were qualities that I observed and felt so strongly, both in his work and as a friend and colleague. We became friends when we were both teaching at Hunter College, and our classes were often scheduled back to back, so we had a moment to talk before beginning work. Soon, this friendship extended to include our families. To select an image from the richness of this body of work is kind of like asking a parent which of their kids they love the most, an impossibility. But the photograph that I finally settled on was graduation,
Could we get Hope's image on the screen, please?
1949. a complex yet straightforward image, joyful and yet worrisome. The image is meaningful to me as on one level I identify with the girl experiencing this ceremony of innocence. I remember being between the comfort of knowing where I belonged and what I was going to do, and the uncertainty of heading into an unknown life beyond. I also responded to this image as a parent, worrying about this girl's welfare, wanting to protect her and keep her safe, and knowing that this is always virtually impossible. Formally, the photograph is divided between extremes of angled light and darkness. And this division defines the moment. It's spring, and the long shadows indicate late afternoon light. My eye is drawn to the young girl in her long white gown on the cusp of womanhood. She is wearing a corsage over the elbow opera gloves and a headdress of flowers as she approaches the dark side of a vacant lot. In the moment captured by the photographer, she's walking in light, but she is about to enter a deep area of darkness, a sharp division between dark and light. The place is isolated. There's no one else in view. The ground is covered with trash, bottles and cans, cigarette butts, and old newspapers. An ancient trash receptacle is positioned next to the sidewalk opposite the figure. And so we have the geometry of the photograph reinforcing the interplay of these extremes. The open moment of promise, youth, and dreams played against a background of uncertainty. Another element that I wasn't aware of and hadn't paid attention to until I began to study the picture more closely is the signage on the walls of the building behind her. The large billboard, an ad for Chevrolet's newest model, reads, "Style star of an all-star line." And the irony is that in the 1950s, a large percentage of the African American population would have been unable to purchase this car. The smaller billboard reads, "The cry of a woman in the night." These dissonances, these contradictions raise questions. Will this young person have the strength, the wisdom, and the luck to walk through the darkness and the difficulties that she will undoubtedly face? And will she be able to come again into the light? Will she have agency to bring her light and courage, her gifts, into the dark cloud of segregation and racism, and to provide illumination for herself and for others? So the strength of this complex yet straightforward image lies in a moment that projects all of life, the joy, the possibility, the promise, but also the mystery. Graduation is a portrayal of an actual event, and at the same time, so much more. Ephemeral, historic, timeless, and yet very present. In summary, I'd like to share a short little poem of Langston Hughes that I think relates. In time of silver rain, the earth puts forth new life again. Green grasses grow and flowers lift their heads, and over all the plain, the wonder spreads of life.
Thank you, Hope. Lesley Hewitt will now speak about Woman and Boy in Doorway.
Thank you. And I will, I guess, in a way, connect somewhat to Hope, because I'd like to begin with reading up to the image. So reading Langston Hughes' text leading up to the image that I will talk about. For some, it is hello, so glad to see you. And for others, it's goodbye. For some, it's so long, dig you later. Some are out looking at parades, some have been where they are going, and some can't make up their minds which way to go. And some ain't going no place at all. But it's nice to see young folks all dressed up going somewhere, maybe to a party. But it's sad if you ain't invited. It's too bad there's no front porches in Harlem, and almost nothing except stoops to sit on, or steps, or doorways to lean in. And I want to put emphasis on leaning in because that's my entry point to this image. The body politics that reveals so much. The older woman leaning, the younger boy leaning, both with a gaze outward, one forward but to the side. One looking out in a perspectival shift, parallax, and one staying on the pedestrian level, staying low to the ground, almost to protect himself. Both faces, oddly, feel equal. They are divided in the image in a bifurcated sense, though one is taller and female, one is younger and small. Their faces have the same intensity, and that I find oddly disturbing. What does a young boy at, I can imagine, maybe 7, have the worry or the concern of his grandmother or an older woman who has the perspective? So that kind of strange equity in their gaze is a haunting in this image. But there's also obviously beauty and wisdom in it. Is she protecting her young partner in this image? Or is she giving him enough space to move? And I would like to say, in addition to speaking about this image, I had a relationship to the Sweet Flypaper of Life growing up. This, amongst many books that were passed on to me generationally, helped me visualize a time period that I was not obviously alive for, but Roy DeCarava's images just sculpted on a formal level. They sculpted space and in a register that sometimes, if you do not have the acumen photographically, becomes flat, becomes a flat plane, right? So black isn't without color, it can be a chromatic space. And I felt even in his black and white images, they were full of sculptural relationships, a kind of sensitivity to space and time. And in this image, they are coming forward, right, into the light, in a sense, but there is light behind them, and that's also what sculpts them, gives them volume, gives them articulation. And articulation in those lower registers, I think, are what I've personally fell in love with Roy DeCarava's images. Being able to articulate from 2 dimensions, and I want to press 2 dimensions here because that, I think, also is important to think about when we think about seeing someone in a 2-dimensional way, seeing them in a 1-dimensional way, seeing them as stereotypical, seeing them as compressed. And his images, in a way, kind of brought the figures, the subjects forward, sculpted with light in an architectonic sense, giving us a sense of the details, and the details are what give character. The details are what give a sense of what, in a way, photography has its limits, right? So there's something about his image that reminded me of where, when, how come, why, and to fall in love with the particular instant that he decided to arrest the moment. And I mean that in the most positivist sense. So photography is about stealing, to a certain degree, the dynamic component of life that moves in time. How then can a photographer construct a moving image, an image that has life in it, that it isn't stopped, that it has a generational relationship? And I feel very honored to be included in this panel, to be able to speak to the power of his image. So I did not know him personally, I did not study with him personally, but I studied with him personally. And I had a relationship with his images, and I meet other artists, and that's how we connect. And one artist I'd like to name here, who I definitely connected with on a formal level through his study of Roy DeCarava's photographs, and that's Bradford Young, and who I think also kind of benefited from studying Roy DeCarava's images and thinking about subjectivity, thinking about power, and thinking about how an artist can render such components. So, thank you.
Thank you, Lesley. Thank you. John will now talk about Sam and Bunny. John?
The image I chose is on page 25 of both the original and the new edition, and it's an image in which Langston Hughes has his fictional narrator say, "I think it's so nice-like seeing a child talking to its father," ellipses. And I should say, I love the way he uses nice-like rather than say nice. The narrator it's a fictional narrator. It's an older woman. We learn from the cover of the book, it's Sister Mary Bradley, and it opens with her choosing not to accept the telegram from the Lord and his messenger to come to the Lord, and she then narrates this story of the community. I chose this image, first of all, I should say it was very difficult because there's so many that I loved. I chose this image in part because it is not fully representative, in my view, of what a lot of people think of Roy DeCarava's work, in the sense that there is a larger range in the contrast than there are in many of his signature images. One of DeCarava's many great innovations as a photographer was to redefine, I think, tonality and contrast. When he first started photographing after having been an artist and then a printer, or an engraver and printmaker, his photographic prints yielded initially the full range of contrast, from brilliant white to dense black, and that was the standard practice at the time for a serious photographer or professional. One was taught to try to achieve the full range. One thinks of Ansel Adams' zone system, in fact, where he spells out when you're in the darkroom, here's what you need to do to achieve that full range. And before Roy started the photographs in the Guggenheim, he began experimenting and printing images in a narrower range of deep tones, which breathed more depth, power, life, I think, into the images. So you have a wider range, I think, of contrast and tones in this image than is what is, I think, for many people more emblematic of his work, but you still have an extraordinary richness of the dark tones. The focal point is near the man's forehead and his hair and the boy's hair. The texture, the richness, the range of tones, I think, is extraordinary. Another feature that I was struck by this image and about DeCarava's work in general is his vantage point. Here it's from below. He is shooting from below up at them, even though the man is sitting at a table, which adds to the sense of dignity that he gives to the man and the boy. It's a comparatively narrow depth of field, which captures, I think, another feature of DeCarava's art, is that he combines this very sharp focus with out of focus aspects in an image, and the details of the eyes of the man and the way in which the man's eyes and the boy's eyes, the man is looking down, the boy's eyes are pointing up, almost kind of parallel, which I find fascinating. And we cannot see the boy's mouth. As Langston Hughes said in his fictional narrative, he's talking to his father, we can't see his mouth. We don't know what he's saying, we don't hear what he's saying. So there's a mystery of what's happening. There's both an intimacy and a mystery, which I think is one of the rich aspects that the image evokes. We cannot know what he is saying. The boy's hand is pressing against the man's neck, while the man's hand is almost closed. There's a tenseness in both the boy's and the man's hand. And I think another, brilliant characteristic or detail of this image is the way in which the boy's eyebrow almost touches the man's forehead. There is a connectedness between the eyebrow and the forehead, which I find extremely rich. In that, I think that these details of the image achieve not just a humanist sensibility, but also almost a kind of cosmic sensibility in the sense of fate or chance, both in the eyebrow almost touching the forehead. To what degree is that just fate or luck given the circumstances of this scene? I think that's a very powerful moment. Another aspect is that what appears to be the boy's glass is in the foreground, out of focus, as opposed to what's in focus. And so the combination of both mystery and almost inscrutability on the one hand, coupled with this sense of intimacy and connectedness on the other hand, is one of the many features that I think make it, for me, an event, a great image. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. AD will now talk about Woman at Railing. Oh. Is that? Sorry, then what I have here.
Oh, that's the title of it. I'm sorry. My mistake. I didn't realize that was the picture's title. At the party celebrating this fine new edition of Sweet Flypaper a few weeks ago, Sherry Turner DeCarava's made a point of thanking Sister Mary Bradley, the narrative voice binding together these photographs by Roy DeCarava. Let me remind you that 4 years after the publication of Sweet Flypaper, in 1959, A Raisin in the Sun, the play by Lorraine Hansberry, whose title comes from the poem Harlem by Langston Hughes, debuted on Broadway. I suspect that Hansberry knew Sweet Flypaper, not only because she clearly knew and loved the work of Hughes, but because the two projects resonate with and amplify each other. Some of you may remember this story. During rehearsals for A Raisin in the Sun, with its almost entirely black cast, its black director, and its black playwright, everyone involved, from the producers on down, had no idea who would come to a Broadway theater to watch a play about African-American working-class travails. It seemed entirely possible that the play would flop, would close on opening night. Lloyd Richards, the director, later recalled an experience he had watching audience members buy their tickets at the box office during the first days of the play's run. He asked a black woman who was complaining about the ticket price why she was still purchasing it. She replied, "The word's out in my neighborhood that something's going on down here that concerns me, so I had to come down here to find out what it was about." And indeed, black people, including many who had never set foot in a Broadway theater before, contributed substantially to the play's survival in its first months and thereafter. Something was also going on in Roy DeCarava's early photographs that concerned that woman and many others like her, the Sister Mary Bradleys of the world, not all of them by any means black. But I don't think it was as immediately apparent to them as was the significance of Hansberry's work, because unlike mainstream theater, hardly anyone took photography seriously at the time. The idea that a photograph could function not just denotatively but connotatively, that it could go beyond documentation to constitute a form of personal poetry, had not really seeped into public consciousness. Moreover, the understanding that a sequence of photographs made with a poet's sensibility and intent could become more than the sum of its parts, could achieve the status of literature, was new and challenging even within the world of photography. The 50s saw a number of such projects: Sid Grossman's Journey to the Cape, Dave Heath's A Dialogue with Solitude, most notably Robert Frank's The Americans. None found much of an audience. Only W. Eugene Smith's astonishing Essays for Life magazine succeeded in this vein, in no small part because he embedded those images in narrative structures with his own distinctive prose voice, telling those stories. So DeCarava's work needed someone to contextualize for the audience those images, a spokesperson known to and respected by that community. That was Langston Hughes' genius as editor and sequencer and voiceover for this book. And I would propose that what he achieved therein, though radically different in kind, constitutes an editorial accomplishment that bears comparison with what Robert Frank did with his own pictures in The Americans, published in 1958. To use a distinction from general systems theory, Hughes took a heap and made of it a whole. And the key device by which he realized this goal was the invention of Sister Mary Bradley, whose persona gave shape and coherence to Roy's disorganized box of photographs. This is the intimate voice of someone going through a family album or a shoebox full of family pictures and captioning them for a friendly visitor. It's a female voice and a strong voice, befitting the work of two men who, in their different ways, were clearly in touch with what Young would have called their feminine aspects. As a first-time reader, you engage with that voice as you move through the book, and inevitably form some vague image of the speaker without anything to flesh it out. Brilliantly, Hughes positions that defining image, in most regards an utterly conventional street portrait of a smiling, confident, elderly black woman posing in her Sunday best, at the book's very conclusion, where it comes as both a total surprise and an absolute inevitability. Among its core aspects, photography particularizes as a medium. Hughes holds off until this moment to reveal the visual identity of this particular woman. And when at last you see her, you think, of course that's who's told you this story, with all her gravity and humor and grace. You recognize her immediately. You knew it was her all along.
And now, Roddy.
Thank you. I chose the image from page 84 of a young boy reading a comic book. I loved comics as a kid, and I also loved to hang out in doorways. But at any rate, I was trained as a 19th century literary historian, so my interest in like the visual motifs that circulate in DeCarava's photographic oeuvre actually kind of speak to my interest in visual culture in general from the 19th century. And so I'm going to try and talk about the kind of framing mechanism that I see here in this particular image that harkens back to an earlier period when black figures were both within and outside the frame of American genre painting. If all pictures want something from us, to paraphrase visual culture theorist W.J.T. Mitchell, what exactly is this photograph desiring? That is, what type of dialogue does it seek to initiate through the formal properties of its composition and the subject matter of its content? Ironically, to broach these concerns, it is necessary to make at least a passing comment on what this image doesn't implore from the viewer. Because the carver's photograph is taken from an angle that eschews the type of flat, and I don't mean this in a critical way, frontal composition that is characteristic of his window portraits, the photograph above is not soliciting a response that begins and ends with the contemplative act of a child simply reading a comic book within the framework of a parlor window. In fact, when considering just how much of the interior's architectural details and window treatment are on display, the photograph appears to be more concerned with the architectonics of space and how it communicates with the meaning of its subject. If this were a frontal perspective, most of the photograph's subtle qualities would be lost. Gone would be the distressed nature of the paneled pocket shutters, window jamb, and aspects of its casing. Absent, too, would also be the vertical slither of the parlor's ominous pitch black interior and the dimensional depth and liminality that proceeds, respectively, from the boy's elbow, just faintly overhanging the sill, and his juxtaposition between the garish drapes and the components that make up the building's structural edifice. And perhaps most importantly, the idea of a frame as it is understood as a motif within the art historical practice of interpreting images would not be as beguiling as it is in its current emanation above as a mere gesture. From my own idiosyncratic point of view, when confronted with DeCarava's framing of the young reader, it is impossible for me not to consider the visual inheritance that derives from the long history of figuring black subjects both within and outside the frames of American painting. Throughout the 19th century, black personhood was often rendered at the periphery of a painting's composition in order to deliberate upon the social and hierarchical status of African Americans as non-citizens. Consequently, the figuring of black subjects in relationship to doorways, porticos, and sites of entry enabled a visual language that allowed Anglo-American artists to comment upon the ever-looming crisis of black emancipation. And here I'm thinking specifically about the framing devices employed by Richard Caton Woodville's War News from Mexico, which has a black male figure seated on the side of a porch outside the American Hotel with a standing black child, and the elderly woman framed in the parlor window while a group of male readers are looking at a newspaper which is talking about war news in Mexico, which is deciding on whether or not Texas and the like would become slave states. And I'm also thinking about William Sidney Mount's The Power of Music, which reveals an African-American musician on the side of a barn door looking in as several white musicians are playing the fiddle or the banjo. And then finally, Edward W. Clay's Fruits of Amalgamation, which is a kind of satirical upsend of black abolitionists and interracial relations within a parlor view with a series of framed images and what appears to be William Lloyd Garrison walking with a black woman as his partner into the doorway. The carver's image is both like and unlike this formal tradition in as much as our black comic book enthusiasts recalls a similar liminality through the photograph's unrealized framing motif. While this device places the child at the center of our view, he ultimately resides within the margins of an actual threshold. Could you put the image back up, please? Thank you. Perched between a house curtain and a well-worn proscenium, as it were, the carver's image is not without the shade of theatrical forewarning. But what exactly could go wrong here? Well, if we consider this image in relationship to Sister Mary's opening pronouncement that, quote, she wanted to find out how integration was going to work on Earth first, particularly in South Carolina, then Langston Hughes' narrative provides us with a context that absolutely mirrors those national crises, for example, war, abolition, and racial animus from the 19th century, that captivated DeCarava's artistic predecessors. Furthermore, beyond the 1854 decision of Brown versus the Board of Education, it's also possible that this image provides some meta-commentary on DeCarava's tension with the category of documentary photography. And here, I'm actually trying to wrestle with the idea that besides the demonization of comic books in the 1850s, by 1854, there was a Senate hearing that was brought upon by, I think, Jeremy Wortham, who used to run a clinic in Harlem, that talked about the devastating or negative impacts of children reading comic books, which in some ways is an attack on the genre as a whole during its golden age, right, from 1838 to 1850. Comic books in that period elevated the status of minorities, Asians, Asian Americans, women, and the like. And I wanted to think about the ways in which this new medium, without boundaries and series of framed images, speaks to the actual Sweet Flypaper of Life as a text itself. That's, of course, more coincidental than actually being a kind of strategic move on the part of Roy DeCarava, and much of what could be said about the social historical context that would animate this image as one being about the Brown versus Board of Education would also come through the text that Hughes provides. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. I think we've all benefited from this deep dive into these images, and I loved how at moments the whole panel would pick up their book at the same time to consult. I think we can see the essential nature of this text in the way in which we've all encountered it, and I think at this moment we should also just salute this edition. I think we've all been talking about the sort of beauty and the power of being able to experience this again as a book. And I feel as if, for me, as with so many of the other panelists, this is sort of urtext of my sensibility of Harlem, right? Lives as a way to understand my beloved Harlem in its past, but in many ways, in encountering these images again, it very much also speaks to the present. The present of this dynamic community as created in these images, which so beautifully capture. And it is with that that I'm now going to ask some questions of our incredible panel. And I want to start with A'00 because the title of this panel was A Radical Vision. And I would love for you to speak more about the radicality of this work at that moment as we understand photography and the larger arts and cultural world that this work existed and came into.
Sure. Thanks for the question. It's a good one. I think that the first and most radical aspect, when I was closing out my response to Sister Mary Bradley, I called it, in most regards, an utterly conventional street portrait. And the regard in which it is radically unconventional is that it is a street portrait of a black woman by a black photographer who is part of her community. And that in itself is radical about this book and about Roy's entire project, or at least Roy's entire project in Harlem. And I think that, in a sense, everything else is, without diminishing it at all, is kind of level below that in importance, because it was absolutely necessary culturally, socially, societally, ethically, for someone from within that community to give visual shape, form, to sculpt, to use this wonderful term that was used here, to sculpt that community, not only for itself, maybe first and foremost, but for the world. And to give a vision of that community that was not a kind of day-tripping vision of the community, but to see that community from the inside through the eyes of someone who was a member of it. And the decision to do that in the face of all of the opposition that vision would inevitably encounter, predictably would encounter, was a remarkable act of courage and grace and creativity on Roy's part. So I would say that's where I would start with that question. But his photographic style is very contrary to what most photographers at the time were doing. As John pointed out, the sort of Ansel Adams aesthetic was dominant at the time, and Roy's concentration on the darker, deeper end of the gelatin silver print tonal scale was also a radical departure. There really aren't many people at the time printing that way. Gene Smith was printing that way. A few others were printing that way, but Roy was pushing it very, very far. And I think that in an odd way the two things coincide, because I think to render the richness of black life without rendering the richness of black skin tones, of the coloration or the tonality of black people in all its dimensionality was necessary. I think that pictures made by someone following the Ansel Adams aesthetic in Harlem of that people, of that culture, could not have rendered it the way they saw it. Does that make sense? You know?
No, it does.
I mean, there's another picture of Roy's that I think of as I say this, and it's a picture made, if I remember correctly, on some kind of integration march, and it's just this row. I think it's 2 black men and a woman, or 3 black men and a woman. I forget, but the range of tones that he renders as he sculpts them, and they are sculpted in his images, it's just extraordinary, and it makes them full physical beings in all of their dimensionality in a way that a different kind of photographic strategy could not possibly have done. So I think in a certain way Roy went in that direction with his printing because he had to, because it was the only style of printing that made sense with his work, with what he wanted his work to do, what he wanted his work to show people about his subject matter. And I think that these went hand in hand. So I would say that if I was asked for what was radical about Roy's work to me, those were the two highlights, so to speak.
Thank you. Hope, I would like to ask you, as someone who is a colleague of Roy's and who's had the occasion to think about these works, what was the experience for this exercise of looking at these works again? What did you see differently or think differently or learn from this reintroduction to thinking about DeCarava's work?
Well, that's a good question. I was drawn in a way that I had not, the way I had not been before, because I lived with the pictures and looked at them. You mentioned someone who took the book to bed with them every night and looked at. I was doing the same thing. And the richness and the depth and the dimensionality of what I was observing, and then the smaller details that I hadn't picked up on before. These were the things that drew me in and that were so wonderful to find. So, I don't know.
Thank you, Hope. John, we talk about this work as a collaboration, right? Words and images. Can you talk about the sort of synergy, the way in which this sort of collision of the sort of voice and the vision come together of these two great figures, but also create something unique in this collaborative form?
Yes, I do think this is a truly unique collaboration. It is, in my view, the richest collaboration of image text, photograph text that's been done. The specific context is that after Roy received his Guggenheim and he published, or he printed thousands of photographs and was having difficulty as a young photographer getting an exhibition and or printed. And he knew Langston Hughes not well, and he was familiar with the Hughes's Sweet sketches, and he felt because of that work, if there's one person who could put text to images and at the same time allow the images to breathe and live as separate entities, it would be Langston Hughes. And he called him up, and Hughes immediately said, come over, and he gathered together a couple hundred prints, and Hughes, I quoted it earlier, Hughes said, we have to publish these immediately. It was discussion between Simon & Schuster and Roy and Langston about putting together this truly remarkable collection of image and text. And Langston, according to Roy in an interview, he said that Langston did not want to know anything about the context of the images, which meant that he trusted the images and appreciated the images themselves. And then his creation of fiction, I think, also helps the images stand alone. And so what he does is he helps to create a narrative or suggest a narrative that runs throughout without interfering with the power of the imagery. And the ultimate effects is to bring a true sense of life and humanity, and both intimacy, as I suggested just in the one image, as well as mystery to this work, that every time I read it, and I've probably read it 15 times, I appreciate it more and more in terms of that synchronicity between image and text that is truly extraordinary.
And Lesley, can you talk about how these images directly feed your practice, right? We know the sort of seminal contribution DeCarava has had to our understanding of the visual image, but I'd love for you to talk, as such an important young image maker making significant and important work, how you see these works in relation to how you are creating images.
Of course, thank you for that question. It's such an honor. I keep picking up the book because it has such resonance, and I think a lot of the questions that I have relating to photography and its impact on our psyche are answered in his work in an interesting way, and I want to clarify. So I think there is the emergence, right? And Siegfried Kracauer earlier, writing about photography in the early part of the 20th century, talked about, in a way, sometimes an obsession with death and destruction and repeating such images. And I think we understand that now, too, even though images circulate in a different way. But photography also can kind of highlight and can potentially, especially photojournalism, which I think is important, that Roy DeCarava didn't see his work operating as a documentary structure. And I wish I could interview him to kind of tease out a little bit more what he meant by that. But I think it's important to realize that we could stay in a certain space with photographic imagery, and also thinking about abject poverty as a subject, that photojournalism, also there's a genre for that, and what happens when abject poverty is kind of merged with a particular subjectivity. And I see resistance to that every single image that I look at in this particular book, and also I think in Roy DeCarava's oeuvre. It's saying that photography can do something, but somewhere in his images there's a resistance for it to be a static place, that it's a negotiation between him as a photographer, what he left as a material presence, and then that has a life, and that will encounter people in various stages in a timeline. And so I think his image, in a way, or his images, have the sophistication, I would like to say, formally, that they invite in, they resist, they move. It's like a navigation. And there's such wisdom in it. And I think for myself, I've stayed away from utilizing a straight photographic model because I often felt that it was limiting. And the reality is that multiplicity exists in life, and every artist has to figure out how to render multiplicity in their practice. And I think this book, also collaborating with Langston Hughes, the counterpoint, like all of the movement that's embedded in the text-image relationship, but also in each image. It's a world. And it's a world that you then have to come to terms with, even your own beliefs as you're looking at an image, too. And I think that is the gift that I accept from Roy DeCarava, and that I hope every artist who's here also takes heed in that as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And to speak of multiplicity, Radiclani, I would love for you to go further in what you were unpacking around this idea of a Black image, right? And how that understanding of depiction and representation is so radically altered by this work specifically, but by DeCarava more generally, and the way in which that impacts basically everything we understand from the last 50 years around representation. I'm sorry, I know that was a lot, but I couldn't help it because you opened the door, and in your read, and I would love for you to just take even a part of that for us.
So, when you say a Black image, I have to ask you, what do you mean by a Black image? Because oh, okay.
Any way, because
all right.
any way you want to take
These are
that.
very loaded
Completely.
descriptors here. Well, it's a funny thing. It's I struggle with trying to talk about Roy DeCarava's images without leaning heavily on documentary photography, right? Because it's like the language exists there.
Right.
He uses the camera.
Right.
He captures everyday Black life. Why is this not unlike what Gordon Parks does? Well, we know it is very much unlike what Gordon Parks does. And it's like pornography, when you see it. And when you look at a Roy DeCarava versus, and I'm not setting this up as a foil here, Gordon Parks' image, there is a way in which you really have to kind of sit with the very subtle aesthetic pronouncements that are just kind of bubbling up from the piece. Teju Cole talks about the fact that you have to go in and get your eyes adjusted to get out the tonal qualities of Blackness there. But the art history that's in these images is actually really quite profound, right? The perspectival viewpoints, that there is something going on in this text, even though this is a collaboration which Roy is unaware of in terms of how Hughes arranged the image. But something is happening when a Carver image is from on high and giving you the kind of panoramic viewpoint of the street below versus what's happening when he's pushing into the interiors of these spaces, right? So it's like there's something that, for me, in terms of that kind of architectural arrangement that happens with the city. You walk down these streets of Brooklyn or Harlem, it's like you're walking down a tunnel, and the perspectival arrangements or misalignments that happen in this text really have an impact on how it is I then look at the individual subjects in those interior spaces versus when they're on the sidewalks and the exterior street life that's happening. It makes me think about the kind of rhetorical power of, going on high and having the command of what's below. You think about Goethe going up on the church steeples and chapels to kind of look down on the city before doing the kind of flaneur-like behavior that happens. So there's a kind of trustworthiness that happens through this kind of arrangement that has a history in art history. And if you study that associative context then bears on you when you're looking at these black images. And so there's a lot of weight that's formal in nature that happens when I look at the DeCarava idea of blackness. And it doesn't have anything to do with the subjects being black themselves as much as it has everything to do with the choices of what types of rhetorical devices visually that he chooses to use. So it's that's for me the black image, if we can say that in relationship to Roy DeCarava, seems to be more about him misaligning what it is to talk about when we talk about documentary photography, especially when we have black subjects. And that scrambling, that arrangement, even though it doesn't necessarily, as I describe it, have any kind of racial implications, as it were, is what I think I pursue when I look at the image.
Yeah. Again, another radical gesture. Now, for all of you or any of you, what do these photographs tell us right now? How do we read them in this moment?
The photographs or the book?
The photographs in the book, but the book as a whole. You could take both. But I really was thinking about the images themselves. Stumped me.
Well, so I would say that one of many things, it's something that Sherry wrote to each of us in her questions last night, brilliant questions that to try to spark us in our discussion. And it related to how the book would be understood today. And she writes that Roy often admonished image makers in the time available to them to be as deeply honest and personal in their artwork as possible, to find and create their own voices. And in the context of what these images are about and where they are, it relates to a documentary tradition, although I think the critics who've referred to it as post-documentary are absolutely right, because of that deep honesty and the personal nature coupled with a larger social context and environment. And then you have Langston Hughes's voice that connect them together to create this community, this world, this society that I think is something that artists and photographers are still very much fascinated with.
I think I'll jump in and add that I think the lesson for me, because right now, I can't speak for everyone, but the world feels very daunting, almost unbearable. And I keep thinking of what is the role of art and what are the role of artists, and what does it mean to be committed to a practice that has a humanist agenda. And if we think about the humanist as beliefs that stress the potential value and goodness of human beings, goodness being something to stress and emphasize common human needs and a seek to address those needs in rational ways. I think this is a testament to how a practice, a deep, rigorous art practice, can attest to one's time and leave really a blueprint for how we should move forward.
Well, I don't want to wallow in nostalgia, and I don't want to mire this book in my nostalgia or anyone else's, but to build on what was just said, I look at this book today and I say, how did we get here from there? because there's an enormous optimism radiating out from this book for me, and always has been from the first time I encountered it. And it's an optimism that we can all just live together and treat each other well and be decent human beings to all of our neighbors and even to people we don't know and never meet. And that's the bedrock of this book. And I think it's the faith on which Sister Mary Bradley has built her life, I think. And I don't know. I mean, I do know in many ways, and at the same time, I don't know how we got here and how we recover from that to get back to this. So because I don't think this is a book about the past. I think this is a book about a potential future. I mean, it's embedded in the past in its own way, but it really speaks to a potential future that we have not yet actualized. And now, sadly to me, seem further away from actualizing than we did back then. So that's how I would position this book right now. This is a challenge. This is a challenge to us to recover the better angels of our nature, or let those better angels speak again, nationwide, worldwide, because I don't know otherwise how to look at it except as sort of odd curiosity of a time that was.
Thank you.
Harlem doesn't look like this anymore. Let's be real about it. And you know, very few basements look like this, very few kitchens, and people could live in kitchens like that and love in kitchens like that. But I don't know. The consumer-like nature of like New York, you know, the transactional economy that's not social, but just about currency, is so large and looming that, yeah, I'm not being nostalgic either, but it's just like, this is how we're supposed to live in a city. That's the only thing I can think about, you know. It is a kind of homage or swan song, I guess. I mean, but that would be undermining what it's supposed to do as art and continue to create meaning. But I mean, how do people even know what this, like, humanity like this looks like anymore?
Thank you, Lottie. Hope. Hope, do you?
Want me to add something?
If you want to, but if not, I want to also open it to questions, so maybe you want to take a moment and think about it if you have something to add?
I will do that.
Okay, great. Now,
Before you do, could I just add a brief bit of historical context here about the publishing of this book that John didn't go into? In 1955, Langston Hughes had a certain amount of clout at Simon & Schuster because they had published 2 volumes of his simple stories, which were columns that had first appeared in the Chicago Defender and were then collected into 2 very, very well-selling books of stories about this character whose name was Simple, that Hughes created. So he had a certain amount of influence at Simon & Schuster, and it should be no surprise that the book ended up at Simon & Schuster. But also Richard Simon of that publishing house, the Simon of Simon & Schuster, wouldn't have needed much arm twisting. He was an avid amateur photographer himself. He's the father of Carly, the songwriter, singer, who I'm sure you've heard the music of. But he's also the father of Peter Simon, a photographer himself of moderate recognition. Richard had corresponded at length with William Mortensen, the influential and controversial pictorialist on the West Coast, and had published the only commercially published book of Mortensen's work in 1940. So he knew the medium well and had a taste for offbeat photo projects. And perhaps more importantly, that year Simon & Schuster had published the various editions of the blockbuster Family of Man catalog. And so they had both incoming revenue from a photo book, which was not an area of their specialization, and also had the experience of a liberal humanist statement in photography reaching a very wide audience. So in a certain way, I think this book piggybacked on the Family of Man. And so while we are paying tribute tonight to Roy DeCarava for these wonderful photographs, and to Langston Hughes for his amazing text and his editorial brilliance. And we should mention whoever did the design of the book. That may even have been Langston himself, but that's an accomplishment. We should give a word of thanks to Richard Simon, whose commitment to photography and to this germinal work midwifed it into the world.
Thank you. Now, I think you all were asked if you had questions to write them on cards, and great, thank you. They're being passed to me now. Thank you. Okay. Okay, so I will take this first one. What aspects of the book have most contributed to its timelessness? What elements, be it language, photography, or a combination of the two, still resonate today? Who would like to take that?
I'll start anyhow. The pictures can stand on their own and have stood on their own, and they can exist autonomously, independently, one by one, or in groups, without the text. The text really needs the pictures, even though I've suggested that Hughes was the dominant force here. The text, it's hard for me to imagine the text by itself, right, without the photographs. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really the combination, it's the potency of the combination, mm-hmm, that matters, and it makes this. There's a book about the great photo books, and this is one of the books in that book. And the reason is not just the photographs. The reason is the combination.
The combo, yeah.
Anyone else? Just add briefly, the narrative of migration is something that will be with us as long as humans, I believe, are on the earth, moving from one place to another and scripting and inscribing through image and text the nuance, the struggle, the complexity, the desire, the frustration of that in-betweenness. And I think that's timeless. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Hope, there's a specific question for you, which is, Hope, what was Roy's teaching approach, and how did it align or differ from his approach to his work?
Oh, he had the capacity to talk to a student about what they had made. And let's say the student hadn't done what he might have hoped that the kid would do. But Roy had a way of talking to the student and sort of giving him something without actually telling him what to do. It was really an amazing. I mean, for me, it was amazing to hear him. I didn't hear him a lot, but he wouldn't put the student down. He wouldn't be critical per se, but he would offer maybe examples from other work, and the student would go away feeling that he had come away with something of value that he could then work with, which I found, really quite beautiful. What was the second part of what you asked about?
Just how did his teaching approach align with or differ from his approach to his art?
Approach to his art. Well, I think in the same way, his art is not in any way didactic. I mean, it's just, it's life as it's being lived, and you sense that humanity and warmth. So I feel that they were very connected, the way he taught and the way he saw life and photographed it.
Maybe we could also say that Roy didn't lead anybody by the nose, he just opened doors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is the experience of the work as well. And then for our final question, the questioner says that this Sweet Flypaper has been out of print since 1955. Can you speak to why reprint now, this particular moment of nationwide division and political polarization? What cultural, social, or political message might Sweet Flypaper of Life speak to that Hughes or DeCarava might not have intended or anticipated at its initial publication? A taker for this very big, but I think incredibly salient question. I mean, you talked a little bit about this, Roddy, just in positioning it within the now.
I'll jump in again.
Oh, me?
At least to start. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, can you
go ahead. You go.
repeat the last part of it?
Last part
is that the?
What cultural, social, or political message might Sweet Flypaper of Life speak to that Hughes or DeCarava might not have intended or anticipated at its initial publication?
Oh, wow. I mean, like, how do we use, like, excuse me, I got a cold coming. How we use a book, you know, like how we pick up a book and look at it, right? Like what, if you purchase this book, how many times do you look at it and read it, you know? When do you do that, right? Is at a moment of crises or at a moment, you know, it's raining outside, that sort of thing. So it's, as a document, what kind of nutrition it might be offering you in 2018. Like I said earlier, for myself, I look at it and it just makes me just kind of wonder. It's like, where are these people? And it's, yeah, we here. So it's like, I don't, you know, what is, you know, why do we go to the museum and look at art, man? But like, you know, why we would pick up a book like this to remind ourselves of like who we are. Which is still something that we always do with art anyway. But in this particular social location that's presumably Harlem, and I don't know whether or not all these photographs came from Harlem or if some of them were in Brooklyn or the like, I'm not sure. You know, that I do look at this and try to remember something, some aspect of when I came to New York in 1984, you know? And like I was saying earlier, the basements looked like this, kitchens had Formica tabletops and, you know, vinyl chairs and that sort of, that stuff was there. I guess I'm fumbling with this question. I'm kind of swimming in this, not nostalgia, but it's just like, you know, I look at Roy's art to not necessarily be inspired, but to like get in a particular kind of mood, you know? And it's hard to say what that mood is and like how it reverberates throughout my daily life and if it affects what I think as a filmmaker or as an artist. But it does remind me of like a kind of way to clear my palette and be able to like begin anew, you know? So maybe it just kind of rids me of like the kind of detritus of the everyday that I see often, you know, particularly in New York. And so yeah, I think maybe that's how I use the work, but other people are gonna use it differently, but I think that's probably as personal as I can get, which is as honest as I can get, you know.
Anyone else have, thank you. Thank you. Anyone else have any thoughts about
Yeah.
what they wouldn't have intended or anticipated?
Yeah, I've met some artists and writers, and I've read about some artists and writers who say that they don't work for the present, they work for the future. I don't really in many ways know what that means, but I know for myself, I work for the present, and I think that Roy worked for the present, I think that Langston worked for the present. So I don't think they were so concerned with their future readers or viewers. I think they were concerned with the people who were around them, as I am. So I think that they would probably be astonished that this book has survived all these years. It has, in fact, gone through a couple of other editions, unsatisfying in various ways, and that it's come back and it's about as close to its original form as it could possibly get, thanks to the eagle eye and unflagging determination of Sherry DeCarava,
right.
which is why it's here. To answer that question really simply. And that it's here at this historical moment. Sherry's been planning this, she was planning this before Donald Trump got elected. So I don't think that it's here is, I think, a fortunate coincidence for all of us, because it's a heartening book. It's a decent book. It's a loving book. It's a generous book. It's a giving book. And we need books like this more than ever, which is probably why, whether it's coincidence or fate or God's will, it's here now, and it's got a beautiful new form, and I think it's going to have a beautiful ongoing life.
Does anyone else want to take that? That was beautiful, a way for us to understand it. And I think with that, I will say that I think we all have a lot of gratitude that it's here in this moment and speaking to this idea of optimism and humanism and the power of art and the power of artists. These two great artists who, while perhaps they didn't think about what it would be in the future, left us this gift to always have the opportunity to understand their vision in that moment, but to have that vision resonate for us today. So with that, I know I want everyone to join me in thanking this incredible panel. And thank you all for being here with us tonight. Thank you.